Reading Cahiers du Cinema, the 1950s, Neo-Realism, Hollywood, New Wave by Jim Hillier and David Wilson. Introduction. It is still a pretty widespread, though rather vague, idea that film criticism and theory, as we know it today, and even filmmaking too, owe almost everything to French film criticism in the period since 1945, and particularly to the achievements of the journal Cahiers du Cinema, founded in 1951. Two especially important phases are usually cited: the period of Cahiers in the 1950s, which brought forth the films of the Nouvelle Vague and helped set off an important critical debate in Britain and the USA in the late 1950s and early 1960s, effectively the period of Cahiers covered by this volume, the first in a planned series of 4 in the post-1968 period of theoretical elaboration and politicization of Cahiers, and subsequently of film theory and criticism in Britain and the USA in the 1970s. Within the narrower focus of, quote, the systematic elevation of Hollywood movies to the ranks of great art, end quote, but a focus which incorporates the essential critical theoretical assumptions about authorship and mise-en-scène, which characterized Cahiers in the 1950s, Thomas L. Saucer noted that, quote, legend has it that the feat was accomplished almost single-handed by motivated and volatile intellectuals from Paris, sticking their heads together and pulling off a brilliant public relations stunt that came to be known as Cahiers du Cinema and Nouvelle Vague. This volume and the volumes planned to follow have been designed to make possible a proper examination of that legend, with a view to its modification, while at the same time making clear the real and vital contributions to criticism that Cahiers did make. French film culture and Cahiers du Cinema. Among some common misconceptions is the idea that Cahiers was alone in taking American cinema seriously. Positif, founded shortly after Cahiers in 1952, for example, also took American cinema seriously, though in a rather different overall perspective. But more important, neither Cahiers nor Positif was being particularly radical or original in its interest. The cinema, in the popular culture aspect of it best represented by Hollywood, had long been taken more seriously in France than in Britain, while Britain in turn had often been a good deal more interested than the USA itself. One need think only of the French surrealist interest, for example, not only in the 1920s, when cinema was more generally a respectable concern for intellectuals, but also consistently since then, Positif itself being an important manifestation of this continuing interest, while John Grierson's writings from the 1920s and 1930s on American cinema provide a good example of rather different British interest. In the case of Cahiers, the relationship to historical well-defined ideas and areas of interest is particularly clear. A great deal of André Bazin's important work had been done well before the inception of Cahiers in 1951, much of it in a journal that was very specifically the forerunner of Cahiers, the Revue du Cinema, which had been published 1929 through 1931 and 1946 through 1949 under the editorship of Jean-Georges Auriol. In the 100th issue of Cahiers in 1959, Jacques Donial Valcruz, looking back, leaves no doubt about the relationship. Quote, in the minds of the founders of Cahiers, it was never a matter of anything other than continuing the work undertaken by Jean-Georges Auriol, end quote. Even a cursory examination of the contents of the Revue du Cinema reveals a profile strikingly similar to that of the later Cahiers. In the 1929 through 1931 period, more or less equal weight was being given to European, quote, art cinema, end quote, and avant-garde film. Pabst and Lang, Eisenstein and Podovkin, Man Ray, Rutman and Buñuel, Dreyer, and American cinema, articles on Stroheim, Chaplin, of course, but also on Laurel and Hardy, Langdon, King Biter, Hawks, Borzog, Sternberg, Libich, Dwan, alongside discussions of technology and aesthetics, preeminently at this time the coming of sound, of course, and of historical origins, Millet, Emile Call, for example, none of which would have seemed at all out of place in Cahiers in the 1950s. It is hardly surprising that the similarity should be even greater between Cahiers and the Revue in its 1946 through 1949 phase, when both externally Cahiers inherited its familiar 1950s and early 1960s yellow cover from the Revue, and internally in content, clear continuities exist. A concern with American cinema, in particular film noirs, and via Wells, Weiler, Toland, and Flaherty, questions of realism, an interest in realism also in relation to Italian cinema, and Rossellini, in particular, a special concern with French cinema, with articles on or by Clement, Claire, Couteau, Coué, Renoir, Altat, Laura, Graymillion, Clouseau, Lienhardt, Becker, a continuing interest in the work of filmmakers such as Lang, Eisenstein, Dreyer, Libetz, Hitchcock, regular critical contributions from subsequent Cahiers editors Bazin and Daniel Valcruz, as well as from later occasional contributors to and friends of Cahiers such as Lot Eisner, Henry Laglaus, Herman Weinberg, George Sadul, plus the first articles by Eric Romer, then writing under his real name Maurice Sherrier, later also a Cahiers editor. If we then glance forward 10 years to 1959, at the end of the period covered by this volume, what are the typical contents of Cahiers? A continuing concern with American cinema, with many names familiar from the review in the 1920s, Hawks, Hitchcock, Ford, Lang, as well as, of course, some newer names, Brooks, Fuller, Lumet, and Frankenheimer, Ray, Manelli, Tashlin, Mann, Preminger. A continuing concern with Italian cinema and realism, Zavattini, Visconti, Rossellini, as well as with realism more broadly, the first signs of interest in, quote, direct cinema, end quote, a continuing attention to Soviet cinema, Eisenstein and Davinsko, and, quote, art cinema, end quote, generally, Bergman, Buñuel, Mizoguchi, Wajda, and polemics for French cinema with articles on or by Couteau, Becker, Renoir, Vigor, as well as newer names more associated with the Nouvelle Vague, such as Franju, Chabrol, Truffaut, Resnais. Clearly, polemical and influential though Cahiers proved to be, it inherited a great deal both generally from French culture and very specifically from a tradition of film cultural concerns and interest well established since the 1920s. More immediately, the central elements of Bazin's thesis about realism, generally endorsed by Cahiers as a whole in the 1950s, had already been established in the 1940s through articles not only in the Revue du Cinema, but also in the Catholic journal Esprit and elsewhere, well before Cahiers began. Bazin and Pierre Cast had also written for the communist-sponsored journal Écran Français, which also published, for example, Alexandre Astruc's important essay, quote, The Birth of a New Avant-Garde, La Camera Stylo, end quote, in 1948, until apparently the journal's hostility to American cinema caused them to stop writing for it. Cast's first article for the Review appeared in 1948. As well as Bazin, then, the Review helped to establish Daniel Valcruz, Cast, and Romer. Bazin and Romer were to be decisive editorial influences on Cahiers in its first decade. Almost certainly, Jean-Georges Auriol, editor of the Review, would have become editor of the new journal already being planned before the final demise of the Review. As it was, Auriol's death in a car accident in 1950 gave considerable impetus to the birth of Cahiers. The first issue was dedicated to his memory, but there had been other influences at work linked to these same personalities. In 1948 through 1949, something else was being born. As Daniel Valcruz put it, which would, quote, constitute the first link in the chain which is resulting today in what has been called the Nouvelle Vague, the first jolt against a cinema which had become too traditional, quote, Objectif 49, end quote, a ciné club unlike any other, which under the aegis of Jean Cocteau, Robert Bresson, Roger Lienhardt, René Clement, Alexandre Astruc, Pierre Cast, Raymond Queneau, etc., brought together all those critics, filmmakers, and future filmmakers who dreamed of a cinema d'auteurs. It was then, from the background of the Revue du Cinema and, quote, Objectif 49, end quote, that Cahiers derived its main contribution. I'll read it back. It was then from the background of the Revue du Cinema and, quote, Objectif 49, end quote, that Cahiers derived its main contributors and concerns when the first issue was finally published in April 1951, with Lo Duca, who had also been active on the Review, Bazin and Daniel Valcruz as joint editors, though Bazin was ill and was not officially on the editorial masthead until the second issue, and Leon Kegel financing. But by the end of 1953, the tenor of Cahiers was already changing. Over the period of a year or so, in 1952 through 1953, Jean-Luc Godard, initially under the pseudonym Hans Lucas, Jean Demarchi, Francois Truffaut, Jacques Rivette, and Claude Chabrol wrote their first articles for Cahiers and became regular contributors. Truffaut coming from a close personal relationship with Bazin, and Godard, Rivette, and Chabrol from an involvement during 1950 through 1951 with Romer through the Ciné Club du Quartier Latin and its bulletin, edited by Romer, the Gazette du Cinéma, which published articles by Rivette and Godard. Among the early contributors to Cahiers, which in retrospect he singled out as important, Daniel Valcruz mentions Bazin on Bresson, Romer on Manaus, Flaherty, and Film Space, the special issue on Renoir, the first articles by Godard and Truffaut, articles on Renault by Excerpt and Domarchi, and Rivette on Hawks. Thus, in retrospect at least, the so-called, quote, young Turks, end quote, were seen to have made their mark on Cahiers very quickly. As if to emphasize the point, Daniel Valcruz remembers that the publication of Truffaut's article, quote, une certaine tendance du cinéma français, end quote, in January 1954, apparently after some months of hesitation, consciously marked a definitive new departure for the journal. Block quote. The publication of this article marks the real point of departure for what, rightly or wrongly, Cahiers du Cinéma represents today. A leap had been made, a trial begun with which we were all in solidarity. Something bound us together. From then on, it was known that we were for Renoir, Rossellini, Hitchcock, Couteau, Bresson, and against X, Y, and Z. From then on, there was a doctrine, the politique des auteurs, even if it lacked flexibility. From then on, it was quite natural that the series of interviews with the great directors would begin and a real contact be established between them and us. Ever afterwards, people could pull the Hitchcocko-Hawksians to pieces, get indignant about the attacks on, quote, French quality cinema, end quote, declare as dangerous the, quote, young Turks of criticism, but an, quote, idea, end quote, had got underway, which was going to make its obstinate way to its most logical conclusion. The passage of almost all those involved in it to directing films themselves, end of block quote. With Truffaut's salvo fired, the journal's complexion was now clearer, and everything seemed in place for Cahiers to do what its subsequent reputation suggested that it did. Editorially speaking, Cahiers was then relatively stable through the 1950s. Bazin, Lo Duca, and Daniel Valcruz continued as joint editors, with Bazin and perhaps Truffaut exercising most influence, until early 1957, when Romer replaced Lo Duca and began to exert increasing influence, in part just because others were so busy. Truffaut and Godard were also writing for the weekly newspaper Arts and other publications, while also, like Chabrol, preparing films. In part because of Bazin's illness, Romer's position as joint editor with Daniel Valcruz was then confirmed after Bazin's death in November 1958 and continued until 1963. But it is always wrong to think of the Cahiers writers during this period as a really homogeneous group. Bazin and Romer were close in their Catholicism and their theses about the realist vocation of film, but Bazin argued strenuously against Romer on Hitchcock and Hawks. Rivette and Godard admired Rossellini for reasons considerably different from those of Romer. Godard and Rivette were more inclined, relatively speaking, to, quote, modernism, end quote, than most of their colleagues. Cast stood out in this period as almost the only Cahiers writer with clearly left-wing, anti-clerical sympathies. But like Bazin, he opposed aspects of the politique des auteurs, though for different reasons. Truffaut was personally close to Bazin, but proved very often distant from him in his taste and values, and so on. Yet, Daniel Valcruz is right to talk about, quote, solidarity, end quote, in the sense that despite their differences, there were usually broad areas of agreement and shared assumptions on some fundamental questions. Authorship. Among the broad areas of agreement, the most important was probably the idea of, quote, authorship, end quote, implied by Truffaut's discussion of auteurs in, quote, une certaine tendance du cinéma français, end quote, but by much that had gone before us, but by much that had gone before also, by Rivette's essay on Hawks, for example, it provided a doctrine, a politique, though hardly a, quote, theory, end quote. The concept of authorship and its essential underpinning, the concept of mise en scène, are introduced here, then fleshed out and more fully discussed in relation to the critical writings translated in this volume in the introductions to the individual sections of the book. The November 1946 issue of the Revue du Cinema had contained an article by the American director Irving Pitchell entitled, quote, La création doit être l'ouvrage d'un seul, end quote. Quote, creation must be the work of one person, end quote. Truffaut prefaces his collection of his critical writings with a quotation from Orson Welles, quote, I believe a work is good to the degree that it expresses the man who created it, end quote. At these levels, authorship was, for Cahiers, a relatively simple concept, essentially the idea that the film auteur was to be considered as fully an artist as any of the great novelists, painters, or poets. Eric Rode summarized their views, quote, the director as the ultimate authority and the sole arbiter of a film's meaning. They required one consistency only, that the director should have a strong personality and that he should be able to project his convictions, end quote. Thus, for Truffaut, in une certaine tendance, end quote, that the, quote, enemies, end quote, primarily for French cinema, screenwriters Jean Arench and Pierre Bost lack authentic and individual personality, or as Jean-José Richer said of Excerpt, quote, the thing most important to the artist, a temperament, end quote, is, quote, proved, end quote, by the fact that they collaborate with the most diverse directors on a wide diversity of themes. But as we shall see in relation to the favored auteurs of Cahiers, this was not all. It was not any worldview, but rather a particular worldview that was being privileged. It was not just the Renoir or Bresson had, quote, a worldview that at least as valuable as that of Arench or Bost, end quote, nor that they created their own stories and dialogue. It was also that Truffaut considered the films which Arench and Bost had written manifested a distinctly, quote, negative, end quote, view of the world. In two important and acute articles analyzing the early years of Cahiers, American critic John Hess argues that the films favored by Cahiers tended to tell very much the same kinds of story. Quote, the most important determinant of the auteur was not so much the director's ability to express his personality, as usually has been claimed, but rather his desire and ability to express a certain world view. An auteur was a film director who expressed an optimistic image of human potentialities within an utterly corrupt society. By reaching out emotionally and spiritually to other human beings and or to God, one could transcend the isolation imposed on one by a corrupt world, end quote. Going further, Hess links this analysis explicitly with the social political history of post-war France. Quote, La politique des auteurs was in fact a justification, couched in aesthetic terms, of a culturally conservative, politically reactionary attempt to move film from the realm of social and political concern, in which the progressive forces of the Renaissance had placed all the arts in the years immediately after the war, end quote. If Hess's argument depends on a somewhat selective reading of early Cahiers, and if it fails to recognize the diversity of positions and the struggles going on there, there is nevertheless no doubt that he identifies and analyses probably the most important tendencies in Cahiers during this period. Reading the material in this volume, one is reminded time and again of the trenchant accuracy of his analysis. The tendency Hess describes embodied, of course, in essentially romantic conception of art and the artist, which we can find expressed elsewhere in the period. For example, in André Malraux, for whom art transcended history, expressing man's freedom over destiny, in a formulation perfectly in accord with the assumptions of Cahiers. During this period, Malraux argues, for example, that, quote, we now know that an artist's supreme work is not the one in best accord with any tradition, not even his most complete and, quote, finished, end quote, work, but his most personal work, the one from which he has stripped all that is not his own, and in which his style reaches its climax. Malraux can also provide a useful reference for the more explicitly political position of Cahiers. Militantly leftist during the Spanish Civil War, Malraux mirrored broader political cultural currents and moving steadily to the right in the post-war period, ending up as de Gaulle's minister for culture. Cahiers, as opposed to Positif, which was consistently leftist in sympathies, was very much part of this context, varying between being more or less overtly anti-left and simply being silent on political issues of the day, such as the Algerian struggle for independence, despite the exceptions of people like Cast who maintained left positions within Cahiers. In a 1962 interview, Godard expresses the general situation and attitude of the period rather well while discussing the politics of his film La Petite Soldat. Quote, I have moral and psychological intentions which are defined through situations born of political events. That's all. These events are confused because that's how it is. My characters don't like it either. My film belongs to the generation which regrets not having been 20 at the time of the Spanish Civil War, end quote. If the politique des auteurs caused ripples and more in French film culture and beyond, it was not because of the idea itself, but because the idea was used in Cahiers with polemical brio to upset established values and reputations. There was nothing new or scandalous in either France or Britain or the USA in discussing, say, Renaud, Benoit, Dreyer, Eisenstein, Renoir, Coteau, or Bresson, or from the USA, Stroheim or Wells or Chaplin as the auteurs of their films. It was a slightly different matter, but only slightly, to propose, say, Howard Hawks as an auteur, mainly because, unlike Stroheim, Wells, or Chaplin, Hawks had not been noticeably in conflict with the production system. It was perhaps a significantly different matter when the cultural perspectives brought to bear on the proposal of Hawks as auteur of westerns, gangster movies, and comedies derived their terms from classical literature, philosophy, or the history of arts. It verged on positive outrage when, at the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, such perspectives were brought to bear on, say, Vincent Minnelli or Samuel Fuller, not to mention Don Weiss or Edward Ludwig. In other words, the closer Cahiers moved to what had been traditionally conceived as the, quote, conveyor belt, end quote, end of the cinema spectrum, the more their, quote, serious, end quote, discussion of filmmakers seemed outrageously inappropriate. As it happens, even if Cahiers did not see it in quite these terms at the time, the more they outraged in this way, the more acutely they raised crucial questions, however unsystematically, about the status and criticism appropriate to film as an art form in which unsystematic divisions were constantly being made between art and commerce. If Cahiers came to be associated primarily with American cinema and a revaluation of its status, it was not because they talked about American cinema more than about other cinema. Quite simply, they did not. But because American cinema as a whole, so generally ignored, misunderstood, or undervalued, provided the most obvious site for engagement with these critical questions. Although Cahiers could be said to have been predisposed towards American cinema because of the perspective on film language opened up by Bazin in the post-war years, a perspective which did away with some of the traditional distinctions in a European American film and a silent/sound film dichotomy. That predisposition undoubtedly owed most, given the political atmosphere of France in the 1950s described above, to ways in which American cinema was perceived to relate to American society. It was, often enough, socially, quote, critical, end quote, but critical without being directly, quote, political, end quote. This relationship was likely to be very appealing to the apolitical nature of much of French intellectual life in the 1950s. Thomas Elsasser puts it well, block quote, that the dramatic pattern inevitably engineered a, quote, personalized, end quote, solution to social problems, and that they distinguished only with difficulty the dividing line between the moral and the political is a matter which affects a lot of social thinking in America. Not only is Hollywood ideologically transparent in the way films aim at internalizing and psychologizing the public and social issues of American history, but their aesthetic and stylistic devices are geared towards locating the value and purpose of that experience in recognizably commonplace situations and everyday context, mainly by means of visual dramatic rhetoric, a strategy of persuasion as, quote, classical, end quote, and subtly adaptable as any which past civilization have produced in periods of hegemony. During the apogee of Hollywood, even the most outlandish adventure story or musical extravaganza had to build its dramatic structure and narrative development on a familiar, easily identifiable subsoil of emotional reactions drawn from the basic psychological dilemmas of the age. What French intellectuals expected from things American were works of fiction, what French intellectuals expected from things Americans were works of fiction that could serve as creative models representative of their situation and embodying specifically modern tensions between intellect and emotion, action and reflection, consciousness and instinct, choice and spontaneity. End of block quote. Raymond Dirknat expressed it rather differently. Quote, one can understand why Hawke's films mean so much to French intellectuals. His very simplicity can have a tonic and a real value as a corrective to various debilitating concomitants of European culture, quote, Confucianism, end quote, snobbery, contempt for decision, action, efficacy, simplicity, end quote. These are very much the perspectives informing Godard's thought in commenting in 1962 that, quote, the Americans, who are much more stupid when it comes to analysis, instinctively bring off very complex scripts. They also have a gift for the kind of simplicity which brings depth. In a little Western like Ride the High Country, GB title Guns in the Afternoon, for instance. If one tries to do something like that in France, one looks like an intellectual. The Americans are real and natural, but this attitude means something over there. We in France must find something that means something. Find the French attitude as they have found the American attitude, end quote. Mise en scène. However, in terms of auteurs' ideas about the world, Cahiers conceded in an important 1960 article by Faridun Hoveyda, quote, the consistency of the ideas we came across in the films of Lang, Rossellini, Renoir, Wells, we realized that our favorite auteurs were in fact talking about the same things. The, quote, constants, end quote, of their particular universes belong to everything, or belong to everybody. Solitude, violence, the absurdity of existence, sin, redemption, love, etc. Each epic has its own themes, which serve as a backcloth against which individuals, whether artists or not, act out their lives, end quote. But if these themes were more or less constant across different auteurs, how were they to be told apart? And what made them original? Question mark. Block quote. The originality of the auteur lies not in the subject matter he chooses, but in the technique he employs, i.e. the mise en scène, through which everything on the screen is expressed. As Sartre said, quote, one isn't a writer for having chosen to say certain things, but for having chosen to say them in a certain way, end quote. Why should it be any different for cinema? Question mark. The thought of a sceniste appears through his mise en scène. What matters in a film is the desire for order, composition, harmony, the placing of actors and objects, the movements within the frame, the capturing of a movement or a look. In short, the intellectual operation which has put an initial emotion and a general idea to work. Mise en scène is nothing other than the technique invented by each director to express the idea and establish the specific quality of his work. The task of the critic thus becomes immense, to discover behind the images the particular, quote, manner, end quote, of the auteur, and thanks to this knowledge, to be able to elucidate the meaning of the work in question. End of block quote. Mise en scène thus establishes itself as a, perhaps the, central and essential concept in Cahiers, and in later criticism influenced by Cahiers. There is clear continuity, for example, between Truffaut's comments that, quote, it is not so much the choice of subject which characterizes Jacques Becker as how he chooses to treat the subject, end quote, and B.F. Perkins' comment on Carmen Jones that, quote, what matters is less the originality or otherwise of Preminger's theme than the freshness, economy, and intelligence of the means by which the theme is presented, end quote. In origin, mise en scène is a word drawn from the theater, neutral in intention, meaning literally, quote, placing on the stage, end quote, or, quote, staging, end quote. That is, the way in which a play text becomes a staged play. For several reasons, the word's original description, neutrality, no longer applied to its usage. Firstly, Antonin Artaud, in The Theater of Cruelty, had used the term polemically in relation to theater in arguing for the supremacy of the director as the person responsible for visualizing the spectacle over the writer. Block quote, the typical language of the theater will be constituted around the mise en scène, considered not simply as the degree of refraction of a text upon the stage, but as the point of departure for all theatrical creation. And it is in the use and handling of this language that the old duality between author and director will be dissolved, replaced by a sort of unique creator upon whom will devolve the double responsibility of the spectacle and the plot. End of block quote. In the 1940s, Alexandria struck arguing for the camera stylo as a, quote, means of expression, just as all the other arts have been before it, and in particular painting and the novel, in which and by which an artist can express his thoughts, end quote, had taken a recognizably similar position in relation to the auteur director in cinema, and one similar to Truffaut's in, quote, une certaine tendance, end quote. Quote, this, of course, implies that the scriptwriter directs his own scripts, or rather, that the scriptwriter ceases to exist, for in this kind of filmmaking, the distinction between author and director loses all meaning. Direction is no longer a means of illustrating or presenting a scene, but a true act of writing, end quote. Secondly, the way Cahiers conceived mise-en-scène tended toward an aesthetic which privileged realist or illusionist narrative. In this sense, mise-en-scène became a sort of counter to theories of montage, privileging the action, movement forward, and illusion of narrative against any foregrounding of the relations between shot, and narrative function against any sense of pictorialism in the individual shot. Hence, Astruc's, quote, tyranny of what is visual, the image for its own sake, end quote. The body of conventions to which this conception of mise-en-scène was attached was, of course, broadly that of mainstream narrative cinema, particularly American cinema, that cinema characterized so effectively by B.F. Perkins in Film as Film. It is a relatively, quote, conservative, end quote, aesthetic, and one broadly adhered to by Cahiers in the 1950s. There is a clear enough continuity, for example, between Bazin's pre-Cahiers writings on realism and both the aesthetic assumptions of most Cahiers critics and aesthetic practices of the films they themselves made in the late 1950s. See, as an instance, Hoveyda's account of Truffaut's Les 400 Coups. Interestingly, at the same moment that this aesthetic triumph with Les 400 Coups and the Nouvelle Vague, it is also, quote, challenged, end quote, by the relative modernism of Hiroshima Mon Amour. Thirdly, mise-en-scène was not a neutral term in the sense that it was the start of an attempt to raise the very important question fundamental to the critical theoretical debates which Cahiers provoked in Britain and the USA of specificity. Quote, the specificity of a cinematographic work lies in its form rather than in its content, in the mise-en-scène, and not in the scenario or the dialogue, end quote. This concept of specificity was absolutely central to the discussion and validation of American cinema, as Althusser points out. Block quote, given the fact that in Hollywood the director often had no more than token control over choice of subject, the cast, the quality of the dialogue, all of the weight of creativity, all of the evidence of personal expression and statement had to be found in the mise-en-scène, the visual orchestration of the story, the rhythm of the action, the plasticity and dynamism of the image, the pace and causality introduced through editing. End of block quote. Much of Cahiers' discussion of genre, for example, depended on supposedly transcendent qualities of mise-en-scène. Quote, the strength of the cinema is such that in the hands of a great director, even the most insignificant detective story can be transformed into a work of art, end quote. It was this question of the cinematographic specificity of mise-en-scène which contributed so decisively to what John Cahiers calls the, quote, radical dislocation, end quote, in the development of film theory. Auteurism, quote, effected a shift in the way films were conceived and grasped within film criticism. The personality of the director and the consistency within his films were not like the explicit subject matter which tended to preoccupy established criticism. Simply there is a, quote, given, end quote. They had to be sought out, discovered by a process of analysis and attention to a number of films, end quote. As Jeffrey Noel Smith put it, quote, it was in establishing what the film said rather than reasons for liking or disliking it that authorship criticism validates itself as an approach, end quote. Mise-en-scène provided the means by which the auteur expressed his thought, as Hoveyda put it, and thus also the means by which the auteur is critically discovered, analyzed. Block quote. In many respects, the attention to mise-en-scène, even to the extent of a certain historically necessary formalism, is probably the most important positive contribution of auteurism to the development of a precise and detailed film criticism, engaging with the specific mechanisms of visual discourse, freeing it from literary models and from the liberal commitments which were prepared to validate films on the basis of their themes alone. The impact of Cahiers du Cinema and the Nouvelle Vague. Such a such a view is very much a retrospective one, but its contours were beginning to become clear in the debates opened up in Britain in the early 1960s. In Sight and Sound, Penelope Houston began a defense, or in Sight and Sound, Penelope Houston began a defense of traditional liberal values and criticism against Cahiers and against a British magazine assumed to be mightily influenced by Cahiers' Oxford Opinion, arguing that, quote, cinema is about the human situation, not about, quote, spatial relationships, end of quote, and that criticism should examine film primarily in terms of its, quote, ideas, end quote. Thus began a major revaluation in Britain and the USA of both critical assumptions and films themselves, especially American films. The first issue of the British magazine Movie, developed from Oxford Opinion, appeared in 1962. Andrew Sarris first sketched out his, quote, auteur theory, end quote, in 1963. By this time, the character of Cahiers itself was already changing, and several of its major critics from the 1950s were already much less involved. Godard, interviewed in 1963, felt that the magazine was in decline. Quote, I think it is due chiefly to the fact that there is no longer any position to defend. There used always to be something to say. Now that everyone is agreed, there isn't so much to say. The thing that made Cahiers was its position in the front line of battle, end quote. There is little doubt that Cahiers and the various debates it stimulated in Britain and the USA brought about significant changes in attitudes to film, particularly American film, not only among critics and theorists, but also more widely, and not least among filmmakers. We can get some sense of these changes and of Godard's feeling that, quote, there is no longer a position to defend, end quote, from a comparison of reviews in the, quote, quality, end quote, British newspaper The Guardian of Rio Bravo, a film much venerated by Cahiers in Movie, on its first appearance in 1959 and its re-release in 1963, that is, before and after the period of critical debate which Cahiers provoked. Block quote, Rio Bravo is a typical Western of this age of the long-winded, large screen. It lasts for 140 minutes, and it contains enough inventiveness to make do for about half that time. It is, in fact, a soporific, quote, blockbuster, end quote. John Wayne leads its cast, 1959. Rio Bravo is a gem. For some strange reason, probably the presence of a pop singer, Ricky Nelson, in the cast, it was not too well reviewed in this country when it was first shown, but it was deservedly a great popular success and also achieved great prestige on the continent. Starring John Wayne at his most archetypal, Dean Martin at his coolest, and Angie Dickinson at her hottest, Rio Bravo is, however, first and last a Howard Hawks film. For those who know Hawks, this should be enough. For those who don't, it means that Rio Bravo is an example of the classical pre-Wells school of American filmmaking at its most deceptively simple. Broad lines, level glances, grand design, elementary emotion. 1963, end of block quote. If the changes are clear enough, so is their superficiality. John Cahiers is right to point out that because auteurism was essentially, quote, romantic, end quote, in conception, and because the dominant critical mode in the arts was already romantic, once the scandal died down, auteurism was relatively easily accommodated in its simplest form, while its deeper implications had very little real impact. Although many of the ideas in Cahiers were not particularly new, and although other journals were working with similar concerns, it was Cahiers and not other journals which had most impact and influence in France as elsewhere. Why? Question mark. One general reason might be that its relatively apolitical stance responded to broad currents in French and British cultural and political life during a period of crisis for liberal values. A certain reason was its polemical edge. As Godard said, quote, the Cahiers critics were commandos, end quote, and they enjoyed polemicizing, busily reversing established taste and values. Nevertheless, the magazine circulation remained rather small, though growing steadily through the 1950s, and its ideas and polemics had little impact outside France until the period 1958 through 1960. In other words, until the period during which the first Nouvelle Vague films burst upon the world. This period, covering the appearance of a number of internationally acclaimed films and the preparation of others by Chabrol, Truffaut, Rivette, Godard, Romer, and Daniel Valcruz was precisely the period during which the polemics and positions argued in Cahiers throughout the 1950s decisively entered British and American criticism, stimulating new polemics and positions, reflecting on the appearance of films like Hitchcock's Vertigo, Hawks's Rio Bravo, Fuller's Run of the Arrow, Cirque's A Time to Love and A Time to Die, or where was I? Cirque's A Time to Love and A Time to Die, or Ray's Wind Across the Everglades. In Cahiers' critics' list of 10 best films of the year, Richard Roud conceded in Sight and Sound that, block quote, one's first reaction might be to conclude that these men must be very foolish. And indeed, until a year or two ago, one might have got away with it. But today it would be difficult, I think, to maintain the filmmakers like Alain Resnais, Francois Truffaut, Claude Chabrol, Jean-Luc Godard, Pierre Cast, and Jean-Pierre Melville are fools if one admits, as one must, that some of them have made remarkable and even great films. Then, rather than throwing up one's hands in the air or dismissing them all as mad, one should try to see why and how their judgments of American films differ so substantially from ours. End of block quote. But if the success of the Cahiers critics as filmmakers was vital to the wider circulation of their critical values and taste, particularly outside France, there was nothing accidental for the critics themselves about the relationship between criticism and filmmaking. As Andrew Saris noted, quote, Truffaut was involved in nothing less than changing the course of the freak cinema. His bitterest quarrels were with filmmakers, whereas the bitterest quarrels of the new critics in England and America were with other critics, end quote. The clearest way for them to change French cinema was to make the films themselves, to make different films. Many of the Cahiers critics had made short films before 1959, often long before, but probably more important was the very clear relationship they saw between criticism and filmmaking. Thus, Godard, quote, all of us at Cahiers thought of ourselves as future directors. Frequenting cine clubs and the Cinématique was already a way of thinking cinema and thinking about cinema. Writing was already a way of making films. We were thinking cinema, and at a certain moment we felt the need to extend that thought, end quote. The perception of this relationship informed a great deal of Cahiers' writings about film, but particularly about French cinema. In their reviews of Becker's Touché Paul Grisby or Vadim's Seyon Jamais, Truffaut and Godard write precisely as if rehearsing the processes of realization. Writing in 1958 about a cheaply made Japanese film, Juvenile Passion, Truffaut's intentions, ambitions, and position, and indeed his passion, are clear. One would have to say that one would have to say that the greatest filmmakers are over 50. But it is important to practice the cinema of one's own age and try, if one is 25 and admires Dreyer, to emulate Vampire rather than Ordect or Ordell, I'm not sure. Youth is in a hurry. It is impatient. It is bursting with all sorts of concrete ideas. Young filmmakers must shoot their films in mad haste, movies in which the characters are in a hurry, in which shots jostle each other to get on screen before, quote, the end, end quote. Films that contain their ideas. Later on, this succession of ideas will give way to one great overriding idea, and then the critics will complain about a, quote, promising, end quote, filmmaker who has grown old. So what, question mark. M. Tessanu, the general administrator of the Institut des Hautes Études Cinématographiques, should buy a copy of Juvenile Passion and show it to his flock on the first Monday of each month to keep them from acquiring the mentality of assistants. And what is the assistant's mentality? Question mark. It can be summed up, quote, I'm finally going to make my first film. I am terrified of falling on my face. I have allowed a script and actors to be imposed on me, but there is one thing I won't give in on, and that is time. I demand 14 weeks of shooting, 13 of them in the studio, because if I can use time in film as much as I want, I will be able, if not to make a good film, at least to prove that I can make a film, end quote. Juvenile Passion was shot in 17 days. It seems appropriate, therefore, to begin with material on French cinema for a clearer sense of what Cahiers looked like, or it seems appropriate, therefore, to begin with material on French cinema for a clearer sense of what Cahiers liked and disliked in it and of what they wanted and planned to do about it. And I was reading the Introduction to Cahiers du Cinema, the 1950s, Neo-Realism, Hollywood, New Wave by Jim Hillier and David Wilson.